Hey all you cool cats and kittens, welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is my show, all opinions expressed here are my own, as is all the music, which I think is pretty cool. And this disclaimer is extra important, as you'll see by the end of the episode, but nothing I say on this podcast should be taken as medical advice. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. In 1904, a New York City man named Joseph Weiss was arrested after sprinkling catnip on the pavement in Lower Manhattan near the East Village. Having heard from a friend that catnip could be used to hypnotize cats, he had decided to put this theory to the test. It's kind of a charming story, actually, a juvenile impulse that I'm sure many of us can relate to. He said he was really just trying to hypnotize one cat, and was just as shocked as the police magistrate to find that hundreds had shown up, swarming and following him as he scattered their favorite drug up and down the street. A cop came to investigate the kerfuffle, and as he did, several temperance advocates began shouting at him to arrest Weiss, arguing that, as the New York Times put it, it was a shame to lead the poor cats from the path of abstinence. The cop did end up arresting Weiss for disorderly conduct, though he admitted that it was not really Weiss's conduct but the cat's, which was actually disorderly. Hoping no doubt for another dose, the cats followed the cop and his detainee to the local station, and the doorman spent the rest of his workday trying to get the cats out of the station, some of whom had even wandered into jail cells. Side note, can you imagine how blessed it would be to be a random person in jail that particular day? The cop did end up using a fire hose on the cats to get them to leave, which, of course, offends my sensibilities deeply, almost as much as it offends my sensibilities that the same police department continue to do the exact same thing to human beings for decades to follow. Anyway, I love this particular story because it's a perfect illustration of the ways in which people get all worried and in a tizzy over something that really doesn't matter in the big picture. Can you imagine calling for someone's arrest because they were sprinkling catnip on the road? It's all just so quaint. And quite frankly, I think it's time for an episode of Drug Cultures where we talk about something that doesn't matter too much. The last 3 episodes were about Israel's genocide in Gaza, Donald Trump's shocking re-election, and the sudden collapse of the Assad government in Syria, respectively, all of which were super heavy, controversial, and time-sensitive topics. I felt like I needed to, in a short period of time, build up a deep understanding of geopolitics and the culturally specific patterns of drug use that were inseparable from this geopolitics, and present them in a cohesive narrative after just a couple weeks of research. I knew that if I waited just a couple extra weeks, the topics may not be quite as relevant anymore. Now, I do recommend you listen to all these episodes. I learned a lot making them, and I'm sure you'll learn something by listening to them. But wow, were they depressing and demoralizing to make. And so, to ring in 2025, I thought I'd present you with a little January treat, an entire episode dedicated to your cat's favorite drug. This is Drug Cultures. We'll be right back. On November 26, 2024, something very important happened. And no, I'm not talking about the Syrian offensive led by the rebel group HTS that we discussed in the last episode, even though that did happen on the same day. I'm talking about the fact that my partner and I got a kitten named Benny, short for Eggs Benedict on Toast. He's a little orange fluffball, just 10 weeks old when we got him, and with 0 confirmed brain cells. And within hours of telling people about our new family member, the gifts began rolling in. Mysterious care packages that showed up in the middle of the night from neighbors and from family across the country alike. And all of them filled to the brim with toys. And many of those toys containing catnip. But as we started unpacking them, we noticed that Benny showed very little interest in the catnip toys, sometimes going so far as to actively avoid them. A little bit of research showed that most kittens don't respond to catnip at all until 3 months, and many don't develop that characteristic response we all know and love until about 6 months. we started to wonder whether Benny was guaranteed to have a catnip response, and were surprised to find several scientific studies that claimed that up to 1/3 of cats have no response to catnip even as adults. This finding has been challenged in recent years, including by one study that claimed that while many cats don't have an active response to catnip, characterized by rolling around in it, drooling, bunny kicking, head shaking, other such behaviors, essentially all adult cats have some sort of physiological response to the herb, but that some cats have a passive response, which usually just means a decrease in motor or vocal activity and more time spent in a sphinx-like posture. It's generally understood that the primary psychoactive compound in catnip is a volatile metabolite called nepentolactone, whose effect is produced by mimicking feline sex pheromones. Nepentolactone, like many psychoactive compounds produced by plants, likely evolved as an insect repellent, and has been shown to have efficacy that is comparable to DEET for repelling mosquitoes. But of course, its most famous effect is this active response that it induces in cats. And this study suggested that the passive response to catnip could be caused by a different metabolite called actinidine. This implies that the effect of catnip, which often includes both stimulating and sedative effects, may be the result of the entourage effect of multiple different substances as they interact with cats' hypersensitive olfactory receptors. Benny is now 4 months old and still doesn't have much of a taste for catnip, but I can't stop myself from obsessively researching the subject. It turns out that catnip, despite its most obvious effect being what it does to cats, has a long history of medical use in humans that dates back thousands of years, including for fever, indigestion, insomnia, headache, and even for colic or teething pain in infants. Side note, did you know that colic just means crying for no reason for like weeks at a time? I'm starting to know people my age who are having kids finally. I always thought colic was like an old-timey term for spit up. No, it turns out colic is just what we call existential dread in infants. Anyway, moving past that digression, supposedly the plant also has antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, which means it's been used as a poultice to treat wounds or bruises. Most of these claims don't have a whole lot of scientific evidence backing them up, but that doesn't mean they aren't legit, just that they haven't been extensively studied. A member of the mint family, catnip's scientific name is Nepeta cataria, named for the ancient Roman city of Nepete, where it is said to have originated. Notably, there are a number of American Indian scholars who dispute this claim, including Mary Janice, an Anishinaabe writer and botanist whose book Plants Have So Much to Give Us, All We Have to Do Is Ask, details the way in which catnip has been venerated by the indigenous people of the Great Lakes region for generations. This level of veneration, she explains, would not be bestowed upon a plant that had been brought over by white settlers, no matter how medically valuable the plant may be. So this is part of a broader trend of European colonists taking credit for plants that actually have grown natively in the Americas since before their arrival. You see it with food crops such as hazelnut, and also with certain other psychoactive plants like datura, which I'd love to do a whole episode on someday. So catnip, despite being named after the ancient Roman city, likely has grown wild in both Eurasia and the Americas for millennia. And catnip's effects on cats have been known by cultures around the world for as long as the plant itself has been known. In German, the word for catnip is Katzenminz. In French, herbe à chat, which literally just means herb for cats, as do the words in many other Romance languages, as well as both Hebrew and Arabic. So obviously, this plant, and all of its close nepentolactone-producing relatives, have been associated with feline intoxication for centuries, or even millennia. And even big cats, like tigers and lions, have been seen prancing and rubbing like cute little house cats in response to catnip. And this got me wondering, has there ever been a moral panic around cats using catnip in the way that there has been for so many human drugs? Especially given the fact that catnip is so often marketed using the exact same stylings and buzzwords as marijuana products, which we'll talk more about later. Well, the answer is yes, unsurprisingly, there has been controversy, though the nature of that controversy has changed with the culture. There's the story we opened the podcast with, of course, about the temperance advocates who tried to have Joseph Weiss arrested for eliciting intoxication. This particular flavor of anti-drug sentiment is best understood in the context of the broader temperance movement, which was at its peak around this time, a decade before Prohibition would be passed. Led by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, and part of the broader progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, temperance advocates saw alcohol as both a symptom and a cause of a social and moral decay, and particularly a cause of domestic violence on the part of men, which is partly why the movement was so disproportionately female. In this context, in which the ultimate good is a social order, it makes sense that the more extreme elements of the temperance movement would take umbrage with what Weiss was doing, causing a public disturbance by way of an intoxicating compound. Though it is worth noting that many temperance and prohibition advocates regularly used an opium tincture called laudanum, particularly in the 19th century, when it was often prescribed for what at the time was called women's troubles, and it simply did not get the same level of scrutiny that alcohol did. Anyway, a lot of the early outcry about catnip runs along the lines of the Weiss story. There was even a similar incident in New York again just a few years later, when a Harlem merchant looking to make a quick buck began picking wild catnip and selling it to wealthy pet owners in the Upper East Side. Naturally, he ended up spilling some as he went door to door, and soon had a parade of stray cats in tow. Delightful. Now, according to his own testimony, this merchant, Mr. Gottlieb, was trying to get the cats to stop following him, and was thrilled when he saw a policeman that he thought would try and help. Turns out the cop just arrested him for causing a crowd to collect, which was on the books as illegal at the time despite being a clear First Amendment violation. What followed was a fierce debate between the sergeant who arrested Gottlieb and the precinct lieutenant over whether a crowd of cats did, in fact, constitute a crowd. Fast forward 100 years, and there's still some debate about whether people should or shouldn't give cats catnip, although the vast majority of sources from veterinarians to scientific publications and even animal rights groups like PETA say it's totally fine to give your feline friend some catnip as a treat. But still, there's some vocal and annoying opposition to this consensus. This time, it's from people who look at the situation not as a problem of public order, but a potential violation of animal rights. In 2018, a journalism professor at the University of Oregon by the name of Deborah Merskin made the argument that because animals can't give informed consent to being intoxicated, we should think twice before giving them an herb that does just that, and laughing at their state of intoxication. To me, this feels like a projection of human values onto animal behavior. For one, laughing at your animals is one of the great pleasures of having animals. But also, it takes away agency from the animals themselves. I mean, many animals, from birds to horses to elephants, will seek out intoxicating plants in the wild just as we do. Merskin also makes the case that the highly concentrated forms of catnip that are sold in pet shops, such as oil and sprays, may be more dangerous than the herb as it grows naturally, referring to them as kitty crack. Catnip, she writes, is sold in small packets and toys as well as in highly concentrated forms such as oils and sprays. The concentrated forms are different from its availability in nature. If a cat were to encounter catnip in the wild, it would be in the form of leafy greens growing on plants, not concentrated. This argument may have some merit to it, but it's particularly funny because it's the exact same argument used to raise alarm, with evidence in some cases, about so many human drugs. As states around the country and countries around the world legalize marijuana, you hear relentless pearl clutching about how potent modern weed is. And granted, a cannabis joint in 2025 may now have a THC concentration of 30%, while a similar joint in 1970 had a concentration of more like 5%. But this argument ignores the ancient and largely benign history of hashish, which was often taken orally in sweet confections at doses that would boggle the mind of even the most hardened consumer of marijuana edibles today. Now, I'm more sympathetic to the argument when it comes to other drugs. Cocaine powder is indeed significantly more dangerous than coca leaf, for instance, and consumers of the fairly benign plant kratom have been raising alarms about the proliferation of a concentrated extract derived from a trace alkaloid in the plant called 7-hydroxymetragenine, which is a full opioid agonist more powerful by weight than morphine. But still, I find it funny that we're running the exact same playbook for cats, earnestly debating the ethics of whether it's worse to give them a catnip extract or raw herb. And this actually transitions perfectly into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the fascinating human history of catnip. As I was researching this podcast, I decided to do a deep dive into the newspaper archive and even the Library of Congress to see if I could notice any trends in how catnip was discussed. And I did. One remarkable thing is that most of the 19th and even some 18th century sources I found that referenced catnip, and there were quite a few, primarily discussed catnip's medicinal properties for humans, much more than they did its effect on cats. The first newspaper record I can find for catnip, and the paper calls it Cat Mint, is a Philly paper called the National Gazette in 1792, complaining about corrupt quack doctors. Their only qualifications, he writes, are, quote-unquote, a vial of brandy, a small bundle of roots and herbs, 6 or 8 months' study, a number of old Latin phrases, and a few technical terms. Of these doctors, he states, they ought to be confined to a closed room, fed on water, gruel, and catmint tea, and if found guilty of taking fees, be sentenced to perpetual slavery. This is the only source I can find suggesting that catnip tea ought to be used as a punishment, but most of the early sources seem to indicate catnip's role in human medicine. An 1805 edition of New York's Evening Post advertises the sale of around 30 different medicinal herbs, with catnip on the list. Possibly the most bizarre artifact I stumbled across was a Civil War-era song about being exempt from the draft, pulled from a collection of Confederate poetry. The song was titled, I am not sick, I'm over 45, I will make my wife stay at home and give the baby catnip tea. So here we have 3 early sources on the human consumption of catnip, and it's probably just a coincidence that 2 of them either advocate for slavery or defend the Confederacy, but I did find it noteworthy. As we head later into the 20th century, however, you start to see a lot less about the medical use of catnip. Largely, this can be attributed to advances in medicine, though I've yet to see any medical science that definitively shows catnip doesn't have medical value. But it also has to do with trends in culture, tied in with the progressive era of the late 19th and early 20th century that brought into being the modern concept of a drug that we still have today, including related concepts like drug addiction, drug-fueled, and of course, drug cultures. If you want to learn more about this period of time, I highly recommend you listen to episode 6 of my podcast, Tasting Your Own Medicine for Science, or read the book Psychonauts by Mike J., without whose work I would not have been able to do that episode. But by the 1940s, you start to see headlines like this one from the New York Times. Catnip cigarettes are sold in Harlem, substituted for marijuana. In this story, a drug dealer reportedly sold an undercover cop what he claimed were 6 marijuana cigarettes for $1. The joints were analyzed and, in reality, were just catnip. But the dealer was held on a $100 bail for petty larceny, with the magistrate arguing that he had defrauded the undercover cop, who had paid good money for the 6 marijuana cigarettes. In 1958, a similar case was reported on by the same newspaper of a man arrested for marijuana possession, only for the cops to find out that the joints just contained medical catnip for his wife, who suffered from asthma. The pace of these stories really picked up between about 1965 and 1970, with the peak taking place in 1969, the same year that the Journal of the American Medical Association published an article called Catnip and the Alteration of Consciousness, which included a set of case studies about 4 hippies in their teens and 20s who had ostensibly started smoking catnip as a replacement for marijuana. In 3 of these 4 case studies, the patient claimed that the catnip was actually stronger than the pot. One young man reported that smoking a catnip joint led to an out-of-body experience. All of them reported an increased appreciation for music. Now, are these anecdotes in this article to be trusted? I know they were published in a reputable journal, but I'm still suspicious, if only because the article contains a sketch of what it purports to be Nepeta cataria, the scientific name for catnip, but is very clearly a marijuana plant, and also has a sketch of a catnip plant labeled Cannabis sativa. But regardless of whether or not the study is true, there does seem to be a brief period of time in the late 60s and early 70s, perhaps prompting the study or perhaps fueled by it, where hippies were turning to catnip as a substitute or on top of pot use. And in the process, the media went hysterical. One New York journalist bemoaned being unable to buy catnip for her cat because, according to the pet shop owner, it was impossible to keep in stock due to kids buying it to smoke. To give you a peek into how wild this era was for drug journalism in the mainstream press, the same article profiled a 14-year-old girl who had gotten into smoking weed, but fortunately, according to the author, had a quote-unquote wise, loving mother who sent her freaked-out little daughter to a sanitarium, then put her in the care of a Swiss family. Needless to say, this was a dark time both for people who wanted to buy catnip for their cats and for anyone who wanted honest, objective, and informed reporting on drugs. But as quickly as this trend arrived, it seemed to go away. There's very little reporting on anyone smoking catnip for fun between about 1975 and the turn of the millennium. And when this discourse re-emerged, it was largely thanks to one website that we've somehow mostly managed to avoid talking about on the pod up until this point, Arrowid. Arrowid, founded in 1995 as an online clearinghouse for information on all manner of psychoactive drugs, was one of the staples of the early internet, and its forums, which remain active to this day, democratized information on drug experiences in a way that would have been unfathomable before the World Wide Web. In some ways, it's a microcosm of both the benefits and hazards of Web 1.0, but as someone who spent countless hours on these forums doing research, I can say that in spite of the very real harm of sometimes deadly disinformation that people post about drugs, from coffee to fentanyl, the vast majority of entries contain information that is far more useful to drug users, or those who want to learn more about drug use, than anything that would have been printed about drugs in most mainstream papers in the 70s or 80s. More importantly, they provide vast troves of first-hand experiences of what various drugs feel like, which was almost unheard of in the early days of the drug war outside of brave writers like Hunter S. Thompson or Terence McKenna. Curious about what the basement dwellers of the early internet had to say about catnip, I dove into the archive of first-hand Arrowid reports known as the Experience Vaults. If I'd had any hope of finding a consensus on its effects, that hope was quickly dashed when I began reading trip reports, if you can call it that. A large number of them reported disappointment after feeling no effects at all. Other reports were more in line with the 1969 JAMA article, comparing it to a shorter duration and more clear-headed version of pot. For those who felt effects at all, the consensus seemed to be that smoking produced a brief, heady euphoria and elevated mood, and that a catnip tea would induce a state of drowsiness and relaxation, and seemed to make you feel better if you were sick. A few even seemed impressed at the intensity of the experience, though it's possible, as always, that there's an expectancy bias at work. The placebo effect is a powerful drug in and of itself. Some entries were simply gross or TMI. One poster described in vivid detail the character and duration of his erections. Another, arguing against the use of catnip, described his experience as a 10-minute high, followed by a night of horny dreams, and then 2 days of explosive diarrhea. While it's possible this is because of the catnip, I suspect this person might have had other issues at play. So with no conclusive takeaway as to the nature of the catnip experience, I was left with only one choice. I would order pure, high-quality catnip from a top-tier distributor and test the experience for myself. I ended up buying a pack of 8 pre-rolled catnip joints from a well-regarded online retailer called Meowijuana. When you look up basically anything you want to know about catnip online, the first thing you're likely to see is an article from the Meowijuana website, and usually it's well-researched and well-explained. But their whole brand leans heavily into the idea that catnip is just cannabis for kitties, offering strains and blends that are more suited to stimulation or relaxation. And their FAQ page emphasizes that for cats, the herb might have hallucinogenic effects, and that owners should, quote-unquote, let their cat inhale. For the specific joints I got, the website even recommends owners, and I quote again, run the joint under the cat's nose like a fine cigar to get them engaged before tossing. But I wasn't going to do that. I was about to do something that apparently nobody in the Amazon comments section was stupid enough to admit to doing. Because keep in mind, this is not just a joint-shaped toy. These are 8 actual joints. After confirming that nothing in the joints or rolling papers was any more toxic than the countless other carcinogens we inhale on a daily basis thanks to living in 21st century industrialized society, I took a walk down to the waterfront, sat down on a bluff overlooking the river, and started smoking the catnip joint. I was curious to see whether the experience was notably psychoactive at all, and if so, how it would feel. The first thing I noticed was the taste. It was bitter, almost piney. As for the effect, well, I felt something. My body seemed heavier on the walk home than it had on the way down. My balance ever so slightly unsteady, as if I'd just drunk a beer, but without any of the fun part. Was I confident that any of it wasn't just placebo? Not at all. Since every moment is a unique experience, different from what came before and what will follow, I earnestly believe that many Erowid commenters, when reviewing any drug, regardless of whether or not it actually works, tend to project the uniqueness and nuance of their present moment onto whatever drug they just took. I had my senses tuned to detect any alteration in my state of mind, which means I might have just been extra sensitive to how I was feeling that day, to my own fatigue.
Oh, here we go. How to use. Break the joint in half, sprinkle the nip, and watch your cat roll around in delight. Not for human consumption.
Okay, none of the Amazon reviews, I kept looking through all the Amazon reviews because I was like, some dumbass must have smoked them before, but...
I think not one ass was dumb enough to smoke these.
Well...
I think you might be the first.
I think this is pioneering science.
I'm not driving you to the hospital.
Regardless of whether or not I felt a difference, I do strongly recommend that nobody do what I did. And not only because your girlfriends will find it embarrassing, and if you don't have a girlfriend, most ladies don't want a boy who smokes catnip. My experiment was for scientific purposes only, and in case you're wondering, is that really science? Again, all you have to do is listen to episode 6 of Drug Cultures and you'll realize that in the 1800s, it absolutely would have been considered top-tier, top-shelf science, before we had pesky standards of objectivity and ethics in research. And just to clarify, this all doesn't mean that catnip might not have medical utility, or that you shouldn't get really into herbalism and start making yourself catnip tea or something. Catnip remains, to date, understudied as a potential herbal medicine, as is much of folk medicine. All I'm saying is that if you get catnip pre-rolls from Meowijuana, your cat will get far more fun and joy out of you sprinkling a little into a fillable toy than you would ever get from smoking it yourself, even if you're somehow able to respond more than I did. And lastly, I know that this has been a goofy episode, but I just wanted to say how much it means to me that I have people who actually listen to me yap about drugs and politics and keep coming back for more. This is episode 10, which feels like a milestone for me. Apparently, most podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. When I started the show, I felt like I had no idea what I was doing. And now I still feel that way, but I have 10 episodes, which is so cool. There will be more fantastic content throughout 2025. I've got some great stuff in the pipeline, so spread the word, tell a friend, give me a follow on Twitter at drugculturespod, Instagram at drug_cultures, or shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. I'll see you all next time. Purr, purr, purr.